3 years out, and we already have a major party candidate for the next presidential election. He's Congressman John Delaney of Maryland, and he says the key to upgrading America's infrastructure lies in revenue from tax reform. It's an intriguing idea, so I traveled to D.C. to hear about it in person. Congressman, so many people throw around the word infrastructure. We need infrastructure, that's the big thing we need to get the economy going and create jobs and so on. You've got a plan around that. Can you just first explain what we mean, what is actually needed when we talk about infrastructure? What does that literally mean?
So it means our roads and bridges, which is what people typically think of when they think of infrastructure, but it also means our communication system. A lot of rural America doesn't have high-speed internet connections, so we need to invest in that. It means our water infrastructure. We're seeing all kinds of stories of big sinkholes because water mains break, or we hear about Flint, Michigan, where the poor kids have been poisoned because of bad pipes. Energy infrastructure, we're going to need a whole new electric grid in this country. So we kind of think of it as almost food groups of infrastructure. There's the roads and bridges, there's communications, there's energy, there's water. So that's what people are really talking about, and they're right to say we need more of it because we've massively underinvested in it.
That sounds very sensible. If everyone agrees,
yes,
which it sounds like they do, why hasn't that happened? Why do we have this big gap between what the country needs, what our economy needs, and what we've ended up with?
Because we also have a big debt and deficit, right? Because the issue with infrastructure is typically not so much do people think it's a good idea. Most people think it's a good idea. The question is, how do you pay for it, right? Because in an era where the government's kind of fiscal resources are strained, right, it's been very difficult for the Congress and many state legislatures to really allocate the money we should be allocating towards infrastructure.
So do you think we can overcome that? I mean, what's your plan?
So my plan is not to try to overcome that. I talk a lot about that issue.
So that's a longer term thing. You don't think we can fix that?
It's a much longer term thing. It's a big issue, though. What I want to do is find the money, right?
Right, within the current rules.
Within the current system. So the way I've done that is by actually looking overseas. So right now the U.S. Tax code has a really bad kind of international kind of set of rules. And it effectively encourages companies to keep their cash overseas. And right now, there's $2.5 trillion of U.S. corporate cash sitting overseas. That's more money than U.S. companies have in the United States. First time ever.
When you say corporate cash, you mean that's profits that businesses have made? So
that's right.
So it's money that's there to be spent.
Right. Right now, U.S. companies make more money internationally than they do in the United States. And historically, they would make their money internationally, and then they'd bring the money back to the United States, and they would do one of three things with it. They'd either invest in something with it, or they'd give it back to their shareholders in a dividend, or they'd maybe buy back their stock or buy some other company. What they're doing now is they're keeping that money overseas. So
when did you publish this plan? You've actually put it out there for people.
So I started thinking about it when I first ran for office. I was first elected in 2012. I was in the private sector before. I started two companies, took them public, ran them on the New York Stock Exchange. And when I ran for office, I started to think about ways of improving the economy. And I went right to infrastructure for all the reasons you said, but I said, how are we going to pay for it? And so what business taught me was you go where the money is. And if you look at where the money is, it's actually sitting overseas.
Right.
And so we came up with a way of pairing these things.
So you've had this out there for a while.
Yes.
We now have a president who ran on a platform of rebuilding our infrastructure, and now he's there in the White House, and you've got this apparent agreement that we need to do this.
Yes.
How does your plan fit with what President Trump has talked about, what Republican leaders in Congress have talked about? What's the
So two things. First of all, our plan is very bipartisan. We've had over 40 Democrats and 40 Republicans support this plan in the Congress, which is actually a big deal. Because getting Democrats...
It's not anything bipartisan these days.
Particularly tax policy and spending policy, which is what this is, which are some of the most partisan battles we're having here. So it shows there's a deal to do here. And look, there's 50 different ways of cutting this deal. My point is pair infrastructure with international tax reform, and there's a great deal for the American people there. But what people have to do is they have to kind of back away from comprehensive tax reform. Because what a lot of people want to do is they want to use this fix on the international system that I'm talking about, which generate revenues, and they want to take those revenues and use it to lower other taxes. Right. You see what I mean? And my point is that's not a great bipartisan deal. Right. Because there's a big division in this country about what people's tax rate should be. Right. Right. Particularly wealthy Americans. And so a lot of my colleagues on the Republican side who don't support my proposal will say, well, yeah, we'll fix that international system and let's use those revenues to lower taxes for wealthy Americans. And my point is that's not a bipartisan deal. Right. Let's use those money, let's get a double bottom line here. Let's fix the international tax system. Let's get all that money flowing back to the United States. When President Obama became president, he did something called the stimulus, right? He spent $1 trillion to jumpstart our economy, which I think worked, but it cost us money. Fixing the international tax system is like $1 trillion stimulus that we don't have to pay for.
So basically,
we fix that and we build infrastructure. It's a double bottom line.
The conversation right now is, we'll see what happens with healthcare.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Right.
Let's assume the next thing is tax reform. That's where it looks like the conversation is going. And then after that, infrastructure.
Yes.
What you're saying is that that's not going to work.
That's a problem, I think.
And that actually you take one piece of tax reform and match it to infrastructure and do that, and you think you can get agreement in Congress?
Absolutely.
So that sounds kind of too good to be true.
And it's a huge win, right? It's not comprehensive tax reform. It's not fixing every aspect of our tax code, which, by the way, we should be doing. Yeah. So I'm not diminishing the need for that. But I'm also saying, let's actually do something big that we can do. And this is really huge. I mean, spending $1 trillion on infrastructure and getting, because when you fix the international system, you get really two positive things. One, you get the money to spend on infrastructure. But two, you get that money flowing back to the country, right? And no matter what those companies do with it here, whether they buy other companies with it, whether they invest in new plants, whether they pay dividends to their shareholders, it's all better for the citizens of the United States than having that money sit.
I mean, it's
nothing against the UK, but sitting in UK banks, which is where most of it is.
My thanks to Congressman and presidential candidate John Delaney for sitting down with me.